How's it going? Good afternoon. It's wonderful to see so many people here. So I'm Karen Engel, and I teach at the law school and co-direct, along with Neville Hode over here, the Rappaport Center for Human Rights and Justice. And this is the first event in this year's semester-long colloquium on reproductive justice, criminal law, and the carceral state. So welcome. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're meeting on the indigenous lands of Turtle Island and acknowledge the American Indian and indigenous communities who have been or become a part of the lands we call Texas, including the Alabama Coshada, Caddo, Caritza Comocrudo, Huiltecan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan Apache, Tonkawa, and Isleta del Sur Pueblo. This colloquium is part of the Rappaport Center's Sissy Parental Reproductive Justice Defense Project, and that is led by Blake Rocap here and Christina Ramirez over there. Together, the three of us are co-teaching a seminar that this colloquium is a part of. And the students, yeah, it's only our third class. No, I know. Yeah, you all are kind of mixed in though a little bit. So this table is all students. And then others are mixed in. It'll be a variety. And we're going to ask Robyn to tell us whether Professor Powell, whether she thought that came from a student in the course or not with everything. I just want to say that the seminar that we have has terrific students from law, LBJ, and the nursing school, and they have actually written papers on Professor Powell's work that she'll present today. They've presented it, they've written, we had a great, really paradigm shifting discussion about it last week. And so we're all excited to have the chance to engage with her personally and continue to talk about that work. So with that, it's my enormous pleasure and honor to have Professor Robyn Powell from Stetson University open this year's series today. Robyn is a lawyer and also holds a PhD in social policy. She's a leading thinker, really public intellectual at the intersection of disability justice and reproductive justice, as you'll see in her talk today entitled Forced to Bear, Denied to Rear, the Cruelty of Dobbs for Disabled People. And that talk is based on a recently published article in the Georgetown Law Journal. And I say the public intellectual because actually the students who put together the presentation last week, I just gave your poster to Professor Powell, or the sheet you all put together. And you all found her a quote in an op-ed, from an op-ed, and there are a lot of those out there. There's very little that you can look at in this work at the intersection of reproductive and disability rights and justice that doesn't have Robyn Powell quoted. And she's also writing up a storm academically. So there are many pieces. This is just one of many pieces we could have asked her to present. I asked her how she's writing so much, and she said she's angry. I feel like that's not working for me, but if you are interested in reading more of her work, I really want to encourage you to visit her personal website or SSRN, where she's put some early versions of some articles up, and there also are published pieces there. So in addition to being a productive scholar, Robyn Powell has long been an advocate for disability rights. She's currently a co-investigator at the National Research Center for Parents with Disabilities. And for nearly 5 years, she served as an attorney advisor at the National Council on Disability. After Professor Powell speaks, we'll have the opportunity to hear a response from Professor Julie Minich, and we're very excited to have you here today on the faculties of the English Department and Mexican American Latina Studies at the University of Texas. And I was just saying, I mean, we like to have these conversations be interdisciplinary, but it's also a great way for us to coerce people to come over and be a part of our community. So we're very excited to have that opportunity. She too is a disability justice scholar and, among other things, and has authored numerous articles and 2 books that relate to our topic today, and edited one as well. But the most recent one is entitled Radical Health on Wellness Care and Latinx Expressive Culture. So she'll speak for a few minutes after Professor Powell, and then we'll have a chance to have everyone in conversation. I will call on the students first. They'll have a chance for class can have 3 questions before we open it up broadly. So look forward to that discussion. Please join me now in welcoming Robyn Powell.
Thank you all for coming today. I'm very impressed. It's the end of the day and so many of you are here. Thank you for inviting me. And before I get into this talk, I think it's important to get some context. As you heard, I'm angry. I promise I'm not just an angry person. But for over a decade, most of my work was focused on the rights of parents with disabilities. That was sort of one of my strongest areas and something I was really passionate about. And then Dobbs came along and turned sort of everyone's world upside down, including my own. And I started to really get concerned about the implications of Dobbs for disabled people. And then I started getting accused of essentially not caring about parents with disabilities anymore, or perhaps even indicating that abortion was necessary so that people with disabilities didn't become parents. And that is absolutely not my message. Anyone that knows my work would know that is certainly not my message. But it was through that thinking, I had sort of this epiphany about sort of how they were so interconnected and how, the Dobbs decision is going to result in sort of all of these tragedies that aren't even being considered. Which led me to this paper. So I just thought that context would be useful. As you heard, this paper was just recently published, as in last week, in the Georgetown Law Journal. So feel free to check it out. But I think when we talk about these issues, it's important to think about the past. And leading disability rights activist recently said, the right to decide what happens to our bodies is fundamental principle in the disability community, and with good reason. And that was Rebecca Coakley. And I think she's right. So if we think about the history of people with disabilities and the treatment with respect to their reproductive freedoms, we know that we have always had the government controlling our bodies. We can think back to the late 19th, early 20th centuries, and the eugenics movement, which was considered progressive, I'd like to point that out, was really focused on preventing those who were deemed unfit or socially inadequate from reproducing. And a lot of this focused on people with disabilities, particularly those with intellectual or psychiatric disabilities, and those who were perceived as having disabilities. It also targeted, of course, people of color and other marginalized communities, and disproportionately did impact disabled people of color. And the eugenics movement did ultimately lead to involuntary sterilization laws being passed in 32 states by the 1930s. And it also included, what people don't realize is not only the institutionalization of disabled people, but also laws that prohibited people with disabilities from marrying or only allowed them to marry after the age of 45. And that is because reproductive age generally is seen as ending at about 45. So those are deeply connected. This was all given the blessing of the Supreme Court in the Buck v. Bell case. And this is a picture of Carrie Buck and her mother, Emma Buck. Carrie Buck was 17 years old when she was sexually assaulted and impregnated. She was living with a foster family because her mother was institutionalized, and institutionalized primarily because she was poor and she was a single mother. So Carrie got impregnated, and really to prevent sort of all of this from coming out, she was institutionalized at the same institution that her mother was at. After Carrie gave birth to her daughter, Vivian, Vivian was quickly removed, and I think that's an important point. and Carrie never saw her daughter again. And her daughter was placed in the foster home that she had been impregnated in by a relative of the foster family. I think that's also important to note. Carrie was told that the only way that she would be able to leave the institution was if she consented to really forced sterilization. And this led through a series of appeals. And I will note that these appeals were not at all sort of genuine. It was all put together by the superintendent of the institution. And the purpose was to test the constitutionality of Virginia's recently enacted forced sterilization law. Her attorney was friends with everyone involved in this. So again, it was sort of fake in many ways, it felt. Ultimately, the Supreme Court, as I said, did find this to be constitutional. And in part, Justice Holmes, writing for the majority, said that 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And that was indicating that Carrie was an imbecile, Carrie's mother was an imbecile, and that Carrie's daughter was also an imbecile. I think it's important to note that there's first of all, no indication that any of the 3 actually had disabilities. In fact, her years later, it was really discovered that Carrie probably was just in the institution because she was poor. Same with her mom, and that her daughter Vivian was on honor roll. And they were doing IQ tests on like a 2-3-month-old. So I don't know how they could have made such a determination. Her daughter ended up passing away at the age of 8, but she had some illness at the time. Carrie never saw her. They are actually, strangely enough, buried very close to one another in a cemetery. But Carrie, in later interviews, always talked about her greatest regret was being able to never have children again. So I think I'm telling you this all not just to be sort of a downer, but to show sort of how the right to parent is so interconnected to all of this. So because of the eugenics movement, at least 70,000 people, primarily people with disabilities, were subjected to forced sterilization. I always like to preface it with the at least, because I have a hard time believing that anyone was keeping good track of the numbers. I just don't believe that to be true. But we know that there is a long-lasting legacy from this decision. Not only has this decision, which was only about 500 words, and has had long-lasting impact, still important to recognize, but it's also considered good law. It's never, ever, ever been overturned. But I think it shows sort of what happens when the government gets to control people with disabilities, reproductive decision-making, and freedom. So with that historical context, I think it shows sort of the importance of Dobbs for people with disabilities. And as I said, this paper came about really from my anger, but I really think that the Dobbs decision, and what I try to show in my paper, is that it has created this interesting paradox for people with disabilities. So on the first hand, we know that Dobbs is going to lead to many people, including people with disabilities, being forced to bear children. Forced pregnancies, no matter sort of the dangers associated or people's own choices. We also know that these restrictions, as I'll show you, really do disproportionately affect people with disabilities. And why I say this is a paradox is because I will also show you later that people with disabilities are also denied the opportunity to rear children, meaning once they become pregnant and give birth, their right to continue to raise those children are often threatened. So really my paper is to try to demonstrate sort of this really awful paradox that has occurred because of Dobbs. So I want to first begin by discussing sort of what happens when people with disabilities are forced to carry pregnancies to term and to give birth. And so I'm going to discuss some of the causes of this, but also the consequences. So the first thing it's important to understand is that people with disabilities really have always faced inequitable access to reproductive health services and information. And there are a number of barriers that people with disabilities face even before Dobbs. One of the big ones is attitudinal. Health providers have really ableist attitudes about people with disabilities, whether it is telling them that they shouldn't have children, or not even thinking about them as sexual beings and not asking, are they sexually active? We see that there are sort of these negative perceptions and attitudes from health providers that impacts one's access to receive care. Another barrier is physical access. Doctors' offices, healthcare facilities, they're incredibly inaccessible. Think about exam tables. Think about rooms, how tight they are. Think about things like mammogram machines. Every part of the healthcare experience is very inaccessible. Another barrier is just policy. There are a number of policies that are incredibly discriminatory towards people with disabilities. Things like the fact that Medicaid will often not provide preconception care before a person with a disability even decides if they want to have pregnancy. So most disabled people have Medicaid as their primary insurer, and often Medicaid won't even pay. So if someone with a disability is trying to decide, should I have a child or not? Is this a good idea? Medicaid won't pay for that appointment in many states. There's also just programmatic access. Does the provider know how to get interpreters for someone who's deaf or hard of hearing? Is there accessible formats for paperwork? Do they know and have the ability to spend extra time with someone maybe who has an intellectual disability and needs extra time to understand things? And then there is, of course, social attitudes and barriers. Stigma and discrimination is very real for people with disabilities, and that includes, and I would say especially in the world of reproductive health services and information. Another issue is transportation. There is a lack of accessible and affordable transportation available to people with disabilities, which means that they can't even get to a doctor's appointment often. So all of these issues lead to a number of reproductive health disparities. One of them is that people with disabilities are 40% more likely to have an unintended pregnancy than a non-disabled person. And I would contend that that is a lot of the fact that people with disabilities aren't able to access reproductive health care and not only get there, but be asked the right questions. So disabled people often don't even get asked, are you sexually active? Which then would lead to a conversation about whether they want or need contraception. People with disabilities also have this really awful and unfortunate experience with respect to contraception. With respect to some people with disabilities are forced to take contraception. Think of Britney Spears. And then there's some disabled people that don't get access to contraception. And it all comes down to the fact that no one is considering sort of what people with disabilities actually want and need. We know that women with cognitive disabilities are 93% more likely not to have any contraceptive access, and women with women with physical disabilities are 45% less likely to use oral contraception. So again, very reduced access. We also know that there is a significant lack of accessible sex education available for both young adults, but also adults with disabilities. Earlier today, I was meeting with students and I told them that in another life, I was actually a social worker and I worked with adults who had intellectual disabilities, and I got in trouble because I brought a banana and condoms into work one day to give them a demonstration. They were all individuals that were in their 20s and early 30s. And yet I was told that this was highly inappropriate. I then reminded them that they should invest in some nurseries then. Because my consumers were very much sexually active. And we know that only 3 states mandate sex education for students with disabilities. In fact, many times when sex ed comes up in classes, students with disabilities are taken out of the class. We also know that in general, sex ed, the curriculum has a lot of problems, but one of which it doesn't even include disabled people. So we don't even think of people with disabilities as sexual beings. We know that the World Health Organization and the World Bank have said that people with disabilities have a significant number of unmet reproductive health needs. And there are so many studies that really sort of back this up. And I could talk for days about just all of those studies, but it is really important to understand sort of how significant of an issue this is. So that is sort of one factor of all of this. Another factor is sort of our socioeconomic considerations. So people with disabilities have incredibly high rates of poverty. People with disabilities are more than twice as likely to live in poverty than non-disabled people. A study from 2022 found that the employment rate for people with disabilities was 21% compared to 65% for people without disabilities. Another study found that in the Boston metro area, which is I'm originally from, disabled people earned 63 cents for every dollar earned by non-disabled people. So even when they work, they're receiving less money. These issues are even more amplified for multiple marginalized communities, such as a study that found that 25% of Black adults with disabilities lived below the poverty level, which compared to 14% of white adults with disabilities. So these issues, again, we also know that there are studies that show that the LGBTQ plus community with disabilities experiences incredibly high economic disparities. And not only are disabled people poor, but they also have higher expenses. We know that it just is really expensive to be disabled. Just to give you an example, a power wheelchair costs about $40,000. So just to give you sort of a heads up on what that looks like. So why does any of this matter? Well, we know that there is a strong connection between poverty and unintended pregnancy. Recall that I said that 40% of unintended pregnancy, or people with disabilities are 40% more likely to have an unintended pregnancy. We know that women living below the federal poverty level are 5 times more likely to experience unintended pregnancies. We do know that the Affordable Care Act's contraception coverage requirement has actually led to a decrease in unintended pregnancy rates, which again indicates sort of the connection between poverty and unintended pregnancy. And why does all of this matter? Well, experts predict that approximately 75,000 people will be unable to obtain abortions and will be required to give birth, they said, within the first year of the ruling. It's been a lot worse. And we know that women who are denied abortions are nearly 4 times more likely to live below the federal poverty level within the 6 months after being denied an abortion. So all of this sort of is even more amplified when we think of the context of people with disabilities who are, again, more likely to be poor than any other community. There's also the fact that people with disabilities experience significantly high rates of sexual violence and reproductive coercion. Between 2017 and 2019, people with disabilities accounted for 27% of sexual assault victimizations. Disabled people are at least 3.5 times more likely to experience sexual violence than non-disabled people. One study found that people with intellectual disabilities faced a 7-fold higher risk of being victimized. So we know that these sexual instances of sexual violence are going to directly connect to pregnancy. We also know that there are a number of barriers to justice when a sexual violence occurs. Only 19% of reported rapes or sexual assaults against disabled people were actually reported to the police. People with disabilities are seen as uncredible. Their cases are often not prosecuted. There are questions by prosecutors whether they can take the stand. Will they be credible? Will anyone believe them? We also know that the justice system in general is incredibly inaccessible. Even witness stands can be inaccessible for someone who uses a wheelchair. There's a lack of sign language interpreters. So this quote unquote justice system does not provide a lot of justice for disabled people that experience all of this. It's also worth noting that most of the perpetrators of people with disabilities are in fact their caregivers, which means that if something happens, who's going to bring them to the doctor? The person that assaulted them? Then they have the full control, which brings in reproductive coercion. So the perpetrator is often the one that gets to decide what happens if there is a pregnancy. Why does all of this matter? Well, we know that because of Dobbs and all of these factors, there will be, of course, more forced pregnancies that result from violence or coercion. And we know that there is a lot of hardships and trauma that are associated with all of this, and being forced to carry through with a pregnancy that results from sexual violence is horrible. And I don't care what people say, the exceptions, even when they include rape, have so many hoops that one have to jump through that they're not very helpful, particularly when we know that often you have to have reported the crime. Well, if the police aren't going to believe disabled people, where does that go? So all of this just makes it so much worse. Take all of that and then recognize that for some people with disabilities, pregnancy is incredibly dangerous. And I want to emphasize that this is not all people. Many people with disabilities can carry pregnancy to term perfectly fine, especially if they have a healthcare system that is able to meet their needs. But that is not the system that we have. So we know as a whole that in the United States, there's a significant maternal mortality crisis. We know that Black women are 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than white women. And we also know, although we don't talk about this, that people with disabilities are deeply impacted by this maternal health crisis. People with disabilities have increased rates of both maternal mortality and morbidity. And a recent study found that people with disabilities were 11 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related complications than non-disabled people. We know that there are increased risks of a variety of complications, including gestational diabetes, preeclampsia, cesarean deliveries. There's also higher rates of preterm birth, low birth weight infants, and stillbirths. And again, some of this is related to just poor and inequitable healthcare access. There's also the fact that for some people with disabilities, abortion is truly medically necessary. For example, many people with disabilities, particularly mental health disabilities, are on medications that really are contraindicated during pregnancy. So if you have an unintended pregnancy and you have not had the opportunity before becoming pregnant to taper off your medication, you are put in this awful position where you either get to choose, and I use choose very loosely, to stop taking medication abruptly. And this can cause not only health crises, but also increased suicidality and all kinds of other mental health implications. Or you can continue the medication and then put the fetus at risk of all kinds of harms. There's also just the fact that some disabilities do lend itself or require or highly include the need, I guess I would say, for having an abortion. So there is this idea or concept that when we have 2 people with dwarfism, for example, and if they have a child together, they have a chance that they each would put their dwarfism gene to the fetus and they would be considered double dominant at that point, and you can't survive when you're double dominant. The fetus will probably not survive the pregnancy, but if it does, it would only live about a day. So for people who have dwarfism, often that is sort of the only option they have. That's not necessarily going to fall into one of the healthcare exceptions. And in fact, many of the instances in which I'm talking about aren't going to be covered by these quote unquote exceptions that are existing. Another study found that nearly 2/3 of pregnancies in women with Down syndrome resulted in abortions, often due to medical complications, again, showing that really abortion is medically necessary for many people. And as I mentioned, these health exceptions are incredibly inadequate. I have a paper coming out this year called Disabling Abortion Bans that goes in depth into sort of how inadequate these health exceptions really are. So I could talk about this for a long time, but please do know that they are incredibly unhelpful for people with disabilities, especially for people who have mental health disabilities or sort of less visible disabilities. The last thing I want to talk about sort of on the side of forced pregnancies and sort of the causes and consequences of them is sort of this deprivation of bodily autonomy and self-determination. So as I mentioned in the beginning, people with disabilities have experienced centuries of having others make decisions for them. I think Buck v. Bell, the eugenics movement sort of is best demonstrative of this. But disabled people have kind of fought this along, and for many sort of successfully. We've sort of overcome a lot of the paternalism, and I don't want to say we've achieved success completely, but we have had a lot of achievements. And now we see that Dobbs have come along, and really, I think it represents just another attack on our bodily autonomy, and it reinforces systemic ableism in reproductive decision-making and freedom, and it does threaten a lot of the progress that's been made by disability rights and justice movements. And really, people with disabilities value bodily autonomy, and it's due to this history of being denied it. And we also know that access to abortion is crucial for addressing that idea of that one is able to control their own bodies. And then we think into all of the things I've already discussed, health risks, poverty, inadequate support. And we know that access to abortion really does give people the power to make decisions about various issues in their lives, depending on where they are in their life. So that covers sort of all of the first half of what my paper is all about, sort of really what happens when we talk about forced pregnancies. But now we need to flip to the other side of the paradox, which is that denied to rear. So what are the vulnerabilities and implications that come from being forced to carry a pregnancy to term and to then give birth? Well, it's important to understand at the beginning of this that in the Dobbs decision, Justice Alito talks about the domestic supply of infants. And so that is something that's great, according to him, about Dobbs, that this will add to that domestic supply. What he doesn't talk about is where that domestic supply is coming from. And it is coming from marginalized individuals who cannot access abortion, which is people with disabilities, poor people, and people of color. Those that have the resources will continue to have abortion, but it is those that do not have those resources that will be contributing, so to speak, to this domestic supply of infants that is celebrated in this decision. So the other context I would add to this is the fact that we know that research time and time again has indicated that people who are forced to carry a pregnancy to term and give birth often choose to then parent that child, whether they have the resources or not, because contrary to what Justice Barrett indicated in the oral argument, giving a child up for adoption is not equivalent to vaccine mandates. Going through the pregnancy and then having to give a child up is just not an easy task. It has all kinds of ramifications, and it is not something that people often choose to do, again, after being forced into this situation. And yet, once we force people into this situation, we don't do anything to help them. And so my second half of my paper is really discussing sort of how this looks for people with disabilities. And so the first thing to understand is disabled people have always faced this presumption that they are unfit to be parents. Think back to Carrie Buck and the Buck v. Bell decision, where they said that they are manifestly unfit. Well, that manifestly unfit has continued to this day, where there is an assumption that people with disabilities are not competent to raise their children. In fact, people with disabilities are often even dissuaded rather from their healthcare providers from even having children. I can assure you, as a disabled woman, we are frequently encouraged to have hysterectomies for no medical reason, but because doctors have made this decision that we wouldn't be good parents. There are even family members. I've done a lot of research, and I've asked sort of parents with disabilities, sort of what are your experiences when you got pregnant? And it is often sort of family members saying, how did that happen? Which is a pretty weird question to ask, because we know how pregnancies happen. But then sort of, are you going to keep it? So again, there is a lot of pressure from people with disabilities to not have children. They're often discouraged from having children. And this all leads to sort of this increased scrutiny and questioning rather. And I also have a paper coming out later in the year that's called Under the Watchful Eye of All, that talks about the scrutiny and surveillance more. But people with disabilities are just constantly scrutinized from the minute they give birth. I've had people with disabilities talk to me and tell me that it is often like child welfare system, which I and many others refer to as the family policing system, as sort of catching the baby as it's coming out. Like, they are ready. They've often been called from the doctors and said, you know, this person with an intellectual disability is going to give birth on this day. So they are ready to contribute to the domestic supply of infants. And we know that the referrals to the family policing system is often based on attitudes rather than actual maltreatment. And in fact, research shows that parents with disabilities are less likely to abuse their children, and often are sort of overcompensating. And so they are sort of helicopter parents in many ways, because they know that they're held to sort of that higher scrutiny. And there's often assumptions, if you can't take care of yourself, how will you take care of someone else? I mean, I read a case where a mother with a physical disability almost lost custody of her child to the non-disabled father, and the rationale was because she couldn't throw a ball. I've never known that ball throwing was a condition of being a good parent, but apparently it can be. So again, there is sort of this ongoing presumption, and this starts on day one. And I know so many parents with disabilities that celebrate their child's 18th birthday. And it's not because, yay, my child's an adult, but more, yay, I no longer have to live under that constant threat that my child will be removed at any time. Despite all of this, we also know that there is ongoing sort of failure to support families. So again, this issue that we're forcing people to have children but not offering them any support, poverty is incredibly prominent amongst parents with disabilities. And we also know that disabled parents often have more expenses. They have to pay for personal care assistance to help them, for example, or they have to pay for adaptive cribs, and all of these things cost money. We also know that disability benefits don't help. So as of 2024, SSI, which is supplemental security income, pays $943 per month. It doesn't go up if you have children. So you're expected to pay for yourself and any children you have on $943 per month. That doesn't even cover rent. So again, we have systems that are not supporting families. We also know that once a family with a disabled parent gets involved in the family policing system, they're not provided sometimes any reunification or preservation services, or if they are provided them, they are really just not accessible to their needs. So the minute a person with a disability goes and asks for help, the answer is to take the child away. It's not, how can we help you? And there is just a lack of accessibility in existing programs. For example, often one of the things that happens when you're in the family policing system is that you have to go to these parenting classes. And just to give you a very current example, I am consulting on a case right now, and as part of this parenting education curriculum, the state has made this booklet that parents have to read. Now, the state was really excited in this case because they have made this book at a third grade level, so it is sort of accessible to more people who have lower literacy. And I was like, well, that's good, I guess. But there was one problem for the case I'm consulting on. The mother not only has an intellectual disability, but also has low vision and can't read anything below the size of 18 font. And this was a size 10 font. So the book maybe could have been helpful if the parent could have actually seen the book, but she was seen as non-compliant for not reading the book. And that's something that is common. The final thing to think about sort of is the legal framework with which the family policing system exists. And every state has their own family policing laws, but are all governed by the Adoption and Safe Families Act. And this law is problematic for so many reasons, but one of which is that it requires or allows states to permanently sever parental rights if a child has been out of the home for 15 of the last 22 months. And that is particularly problematic because it often takes a long time to find appropriate services for parents with disabilities. And so they're running up against a timeline that does not stop because the world is inaccessible. We also know that states, according to the Adoption and Safe Families Act, are expected to provide reasonable efforts, they say, to provide or to reunite families. But these reasonable efforts don't require that they are accessible. So again, this parent was offered this parenting education class. That's our reasonable effort. We did it, Your Honor. We did what we were expected to do. We were expected to provide reasonable efforts. It's not our fault that this parent couldn't see the book. And finally, I would note that some states even allow the expedited termination of parental rights based on a disability alone. So some states don't even require that reasonable efforts if they have what they call egregious circumstances. Those egregious circumstances include homicides, attempted homicides, and in some states, disability. So in those states, they don't even have to provide the reasonable efforts. They can bypass that all along. Another thing, which I've already sort of alluded to, is that surveillance and scrutiny. So people with disabilities are just more likely to have contact with mandated reporters, whether it's healthcare providers, disability service providers, etc. And there is nothing that says that those individuals are exempt from ableism. In fact, they often have heightened levels of ableism. So they are often reported for things that don't even really warrant a report. I've asked providers, why did you report this parent to the family policing system? And often they'll say either, I didn't think that parent could care for the child. And I'll say, well, is there any indication? Well, no, I had a hunch. Or they'll think that they reported them because that was where they could get help. And that is not the case, unfortunately. They cannot get help. Once they're involved, it is very hard to get uninvolved, and it is not a source of help. What does this mean? It means that people are afraid to ask for help even if they do need it. There was a case in Michigan where a mother with an intellectual disability was unhoused. She went to her state's family policing agency and said, I need help. We have nowhere to live. They removed the child, and it took 5 years to be reunited. There was nothing going on other than she wanted help. People with disabilities don't know what will happen, so they don't ask for help. And in fact, there is also a constant pressure for them to prove their parenting abilities. I think people with disabilities often feel they have to demonstrate continuously that they are able to care for their children. Many parents with disabilities call it this expectation of being a super mom or a super dad, where they can't only be a good parent, but they have to be a super parent. They have to be able to do everything, because if they don't meet that level of satisfaction, it will be used against them. What does this all mean? Well, it means that people with disabilities have higher rates of being involved with the family policing system, and they have higher rates of losing their parental rights. A study found, for example, that parents with mental health disabilities were 8 times more likely to be referred to the family policing system and 26 times more likely to have their child removed from the home than other parents. Termination of parental rights sort of range from 60 to 80% for parents who have mental health or intellectual disabilities, and they're high for all parents with disabilities. And then as a family gets involved in the family policing system, they encounter massive, pervasive ableism. Just looking at sort of what the definition of parental competence is, contraindicates a parent with a disability. One of the things that is often used against disabled parents is that they have support. So how are you going to do all of this? Well, funny you should ask, the grandparent's going to come and help. Or I have neighbors, or I have church members, sort of, I have this support system. And yet that is being held against parents with disabilities, which is particularly aggravating because non-disabled people have the fact that they don't have support systems used against them. So on the one hand, disabled people are expected to be completely independent, and yet non-disabled people are expected to be interdependent. So again, we have these sort of mismatched expectations. There are, as I said, higher rates of child removal and higher rates of termination of parental rights. There are also discriminatory laws. So 42 states and the District of Columbia currently include disability as grounds for termination of parental rights. 42 states and the District of Columbia, which means 8 states do not. Most of the time, those disabilities are intellectual or mental health disability, but in 11 states, they also include physical disabilities, sensory disabilities, or sort of this all-encompassing medical conditions. There are sort of also just very inadequate use of existing laws. So I did my dissertation on this issue around whether the ADA helps. The ADA has been around for 34 years. You would hope it would help in this issue. And I found that the ADA was raised. I reviewed over 2,000 cases, and I found that the ADA was raised in only 6% of the cases, and the courts found that it only applied in 2% of the cases. So the ADA has provided very little help. And in fact, that same study found that of those 2,064 cases that I read involving disabled mothers, 93% resulted in the termination of parental rights. So the system is not working. Or it's working actually and doing what it wants to do, which is separate families, contribute to that supply. So we have sort of this paradox. And I have been really trying to think about sort of what we do about all of this. What is the solution? And so I have really been working on this concept of disability reproductive justice. And this is a framework which I think is critical for addressing sort of the wide-ranging reproductive oppression of people with disabilities. And it really seeks to sort of elucidate and challenge this oppression through existing laws and policies. It really comes from the principles associated with disability justice, which was developed in the early 2000s by a group of disabled people of color, queer people with disabilities, and non-binary people with disabilities. And it really is in response to the disability rights movement, which has really not helped a lot of communities. It has sort of really, the disability rights movement has focused very narrowly on people with physical disabilities, people that look like me, and white people also that look like me. And it has not really looked at sort of the intersectional issues facing many people with disabilities. It also draws from the reproductive justice movement, which is also in response to the reproductive rights movement, which originated in the early 90s by a group of feminists of color. And again, it was in response to being overlooked and ignored. And so the key concepts that I drew from each of these frameworks were intersectionality, recognizing that there are those multiple overlapping identities and experiences that need to be considered. I really focus on the importance of centering marginalized voices and really addressing the systemic oppression. What is causing these problems? We can't put Band-Aids on this. We have to get to the roots of these problems. So my framework has sort of 5 priorities. The first one is that we need to target legal and policy responses to confront these intersecting oppressions. We have to get to those that are the most oppressed. If we address those issues, everyone benefits. We also have to include people with disabilities in the decision-making process. Disabled people have always lived by this philosophy, nothing about us without us, and that is so critical. We cannot be making these laws and policies without actually including people with disabilities. And I don't mean in a tokenizing way, but let's put them in leadership positions. And don't just say, oh, I invited someone, so I've checked off that box. Another thing is we really need to focus on protecting bodily autonomy and self-determination, really challenging guardianship and working towards systems that really promote one being able to make decisions about themselves. We need to remove all barriers to reproductive health services and justice. And we need to guarantee rights, justice, and wellness for both people with disabilities and their families. So in response to the specific issue, I call on using disability reproductive justice as a way to address sort of this paradox that has existed. And I suggest sort of a number of ways to do so, which I want to quickly go through. The first is we need to focus on obviously protecting and expanding abortion rights and access. On the federal level, we need to repeal the Hyde Amendment, which prevents federal funding from paying for abortions. As I mentioned, people with disabilities are more likely to be on Medicaid or Medicare, which is federally funded. We need to pass legislation that makes abortion care a right. On the state level, we need to make sure we're allocating funding for abortion services. Some states, although the Hyde Amendment prevents federal funds for going towards abortion, states like Massachusetts have allowed state Medicaid funds to pay for people to access abortion. We need to do that. We need to also, of course, protect providers that are caring for out-of-state patients. We need to make sure that if people are able to travel, that they are then protected. We need to expand telehealth and medication abortion. We know that most abortions these days are done through medication abortion, and telehealth has opened up so much healthcare opportunities, but we need to make sure it's accessible, it's funded, and it is able to be used. And of course, there is ongoing challenges. For now, it's okay, but I think we're going to continue to see challenges on mifepristone and medication abortion more broadly. With respect to health services and information, we need to really, there are 3 laws that protect access to reproductive health services and information: the ADA, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act. And we need to be ensuring that there is oversight and that reproductive providers, including abortion providers, are complying with their laws. I would love to see increased investigations and enforcement by the DOJ and the HHS, Department of Health and Human Services Office for Civil Rights. This is something they can do. We need to pass the Reproductive Healthcare Accessibility Act, which allocates funding for healthcare providers to have training on working with people with disabilities. We need to expand transportation options. One of the things I talk about in my papers is even when there are abortion defense funds, they need to be making sure that they're funding accessible transportation if they are helping people leave the state. And so making sure that we are fully addressing transportation issues. And we need to ensure that people with disabilities have access to information and education about their reproductive needs and experiences. And that includes implementing comprehensive sex ed and making sure that people are receiving ongoing information even as adults. We also need to finally confront poverty. As I mentioned, poverty is such an issue that's connected to not only abortion, but also parenting. We need to address and sort of the income and asset limits that exist on government programs. For example, as I said, $934 is inadequate. Also, if you receive disability benefits, you can only have up to $2,000 in the bank. That is a number that's existed since the 1980s. And so that needs to be expanded. I also strongly believe we need to implement a universal basic income. And I'm sick of people telling me it's not possible, because during COVID, it was very possible. We mailed out checks wonderfully. We have the capability of doing it. It's, do we have the will? We also need to sort of address the broader societal issues. We need to advocate for livable wages. Remember, people with disabilities are only getting 63 cents on the dollar. Even minimum wage is inadequate, but people with disabilities are not even getting minimum wage in some instances. It is legal to pay disabled people sub-minimum wage in some instances. So as we're moving to expand livable wages, we need to make sure we're bringing all disabled people into that. We need to increase the employment opportunities, educational opportunities for disabled people, and ensure access to affordable housing, childcare, and healthcare. The Government Accountability Office just issued a report about childcare, and it found that childcare facilities are often inaccessible for parents with disabilities. That seems like a glaring area that we could be addressing, and that just came out like last week, that report. We also need to defend bodily autonomy. Guardianships or conservatorships, which are known in some states, they are incredibly oppressive and often unnecessary. There are some states, including Texas, that has moved towards supported decision-making, and we need to embrace that everywhere. Think back to Britney Spears and how she talked about in her testimony that she wanted to have her IUD removed. She wanted to get married and to have children, more children. And she was not being allowed to do so because her conservator, which was her dad, was not permitting that. That is common for many people. And unlike Britney, many people don't have a hashtag and millions of fans behind. And finally, we need to invest in families. We spend so much on this family policing system and very little on keeping families together. 10 times more is spent on the foster care system than actually keeping families together. The family policing system isn't keeping families together. In an ideal world, I think we need to abolish it completely and divert the funds to community-based services. There are opportunities to keep families together. We also need to expand programs. There are some programs that exist that really do offer great supports for parents with disabilities, but you have to live in a state where it exists. So for example, there's a great program in the Berkshires in Massachusetts, but if you ever know about the Berkshires in Massachusetts, very few people live there. So again, we need to expand the funding for this. We also need to be supporting organizations that are led by and for people with disabilities and make sure that they have the resources to support people with disabilities in their parenting roles. We need to amend regulations. Currently, federal regulations do not include or allow for personal care assistants to help with parenting tasks. For example, a personal care assistant can come in and make lunch for a disabled person, but they can't make lunch for the child of the disabled person. That is absurd. Minnesota recently passed legislation where they're piloting where they will use their foster care money to pay personal care assistants for in-home care. And what I believe will happen is that we will see a decrease in better foster care funding and less families involved with the system. So we can do this. We also need to pass the Equality for Families with Disabilities Act, which really aims to eliminate discrimination in the family policing system. Department of Health and Human Services just recently issued amended regulations for Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and it now does include the family policing system and talks about how agencies cannot discriminate against parents with disabilities. So I want to see people using that new regulations to challenge this issue. And we need to work towards abolishing the system completely and address the disproportionate impact of marginalized families, including parents with disabilities. We have to prioritize family preservation and support. We need to recognize that it's so much, not just about sort of what's right, but also it's costless. So it should be something that should be embraced by everyone. And I think it can address sort of this paradox that exists if we sort of take on these issues, these multifaceted issues, we can finally come to a world where there is reproductive equity for people with disabilities. So thank you very much.
So I'm a literary critic, so we read our remarks, which is not super accessible. So I have like remarks that I wrote that I will read, and I will deviate from them a lot. But if that's not accessible to you, and it would be more accessible if you had like kind of a script you could follow along with, I have QR codes that link to a Google Doc. So if you would like, don't be shy about coming to get one or getting a QR code. So I'm really grateful and excited to be here because I have been hearing about these events like for the last year, and my own reproductive status as a parent of very young twins has kept me from doing a lot of extracurricular activities in recent years. So I'm really, really happy to be here. I'm so grateful for your talk, Professor Powell. And so I understand my job is just to kick off the conversation. So I want to say a few words about Professor Powell's presentation from my own perspective as both kind of a news junkie and also a cultural studies scholar who works at the intersection of race, disability, and feminism, just about the disability reproductive justice framework that Professor Powell presented, and what I see as its real importance. So given the topic that brings us together today, I imagine I'm not the only one who has been following with sadness and horror the unfolding media coverage of the death of Amber Nicole Thurman. I'm seeing some people nodding. But for those of you who don't know who she is, she died in 2022, actually, but her death came to public attention a week ago today from a ProPublica report by Kavitha Surana about women who died in my home state of Georgia since its 6-week abortion ban took effect. And so the details of the story are that she was a 28-year-old single mother. The ProPublica report describes her as healthy, which I take to mean non-disabled. But I'm going to talk about how this framework, right, really illustrates how these concerns impact all of us across a kind of broad range of intersections of society. So she had just moved from her parents' home into an apartment with her 6-year-old son, and she was planning to enroll in nursing school. And she discovered just too late for Georgia's 6-week cutoff and right after the ban took effect that she was pregnant with twins. She scheduled a surgical abortion in North Carolina, but then hit a traffic jam. And so the clinic didn't hold her appointment. So they gave her mifepristone pills. But then she experienced an extremely rare complication from mifepristone. And in Georgia, where she had returned, was not able to get, the doctors would not intervene as she went into sepsis because of fear that intervening to save her life, would violate the abortion ban. And so she died. So even before this restrictive abortion law, Georgia had one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the country, with Black women like Thurman more than 3 times likely to die of pregnancy complications. But while the details of the story itself are awful, right, and it just came to light like a week ago, what's really worse is the way the reporting on this story has, to my mind, sort of increased the violence of it. So after the report came out, Marjorie Taylor Greene, for instance, tweeted that Thurman died not from an abortion ban, but from taking abortion pills. And when I Googled her name just to make sure I was getting all the details right, I encountered a lot of op-ed headlines, which I didn't click on, but that blamed either mifepristone or Thurman herself for her death. So there are disability scholars who might question why I'm bringing Amber Nicole Thurman up, right? Asking what her story has to do precisely with disability. And when I was actually starting out as a disability scholar 2 decades ago, as a graduate student, most of the sources on abortion and disability that I was able to find at the time were about the issue of selective abortions, and often were from sort of disability rights advocates. Professor Powell talked about the distinction between disability rights and disability justice, right? So the limited nature of disability rights versus disability justice. So a lot of what I was able to find at the time, 2 decades ago, was really kind of using the issue of disability to support abortion restrictions. And I think there are really difficult issues at hand, right? There are ways in which the systemic devaluation of the lives of people with disabilities, is something that needs to be contested. But this all just really shows, I think, the necessity of a framework, right, that can support both disability justice and reproductive justice. So my own work looks at racial health disparities from a disability justice perspective and examines the racializing and ableist logics that blame people of color like Amber Nicole Thurman for their own poor health outcomes and deaths. And for these reasons, I see Professor Powell's insistence on a necessary relationship between disability justice and reproductive justice as advancing crucial knowledge that we all need to combat the violence of Dobbs. So Amber Nicole Thurman was not, to my knowledge, disabled, but justice for Amber Nicole Thurman requires, I think, disability justice. And likewise, I think disability justice requires an understanding of the racism and ableism that made possible Thurman's death. So why is this so? I want to highlight in particular Professor Powell's emphasis on the importance of medication abortion as a form of abortion that's more accessible, right? Not only to disabled people, but also to people experiencing relationship violence, people experiencing reproductive coercion, people living in poverty, people living far away from abortion care services. So it's imperative to note that the right-wing response to this has been not to question abortion bans, but to call for further restrictions on medication abortion, suggesting it was abortion pills that killed Thurman, even though the complications she experienced were extremely rare. And it was the medical neglect in the wake of those complications, right? It was the fact that she was denied care that she needed, fearing retribution, right, under Georgia's law. So in effect, the response to Thurman's death has been to capitalize on available racial scripts about Black women to blame her for her death. And that becomes a tool used to seek further restrictions on an abortion method that disabled people rely on. So race and disability cannot be understood separately. And so now I just want to say, Professor Powell, I think, offers a really brilliant framework for understanding all this. And so I'm just going to quote directly from her paper because this is a quote that I really loved. Disability reproductive justice, she writes, is a framework that draws upon the tenets of disability justice and reproductive justice to grapple with the long-standing reproductive oppression that disabled people face. This oppressive system is deeply entrenched within our laws, policies, and societal norms, and thus demands a multifaceted approach that involves multiple fields of expertise, including law, medicine, public health, social work, and organizing. In particular, disability reproductive justice emphasizes the importance of a multidisciplinary response that recognizes the complex interplay between disability, race, gender, and other identities. So to start off our conversation, I just wanted to kind of pose 3 questions, and I'm posing them like not just to Professor Powell, but to all of you to kind of think about. So we don't have to discuss them necessarily, but they're sort of things to think about as we begin talking to each other. So the first is that Professor Powell emphasizes that reproductive oppression directed intersectionally at marginalized people, including disabled people, people of color, LGBTQ+ people, people living in poverty, is entrenched within our laws, policies, and social norms. This was the case long before Dobbs. So can we think together precisely about how reproductive oppression has become so multidimensionally entrenched? My comments have not focused on the denied to rear part of Professor Powell's title or on the ways that marginalized people are denied parenthood of their children. But this is also an element of Thurman's story, right? She was seeking an abortion to be a better parent to the child she had already born. And her death was a violent denial of her right to parent that child. So can we collectively delve into the ways in which what Professor Powell calls a family policing system colludes with abortion restrictions to deny reproductive freedom? And can we talk specifically, right, about that term, which in the paper, Professor Powell was really deliberate about saying the family policing system and not the child welfare system, which is what people often call it, right? So I think it's useful to talk about that term as well. And then finally, I just want to also highlight the part where Professor Powell talks about the need for a multifaceted approach that involves multiple fields of expertise, including law, medicine, public health, social work, and organizing. I would also add my own field of literary criticism. Like, I think that cultural production, art, and things like that also have a role to play in all this. So I thought it would be nice as an interdisciplinary audience for us to think about the ways in which each of us have something to contribute to the advancement of disability reproductive justice from our own disciplinary vantage points. So I'm really excited for the conversation now.
We open it up and then you make sure that. Yeah. Okay. So we actually have a system that we follow here where if you have a new idea, you can raise one thing, but that doesn't be a new idea in the world. But a question that hasn't been asked, but also sometimes, people are talking and you want to jump in on something. So you have to put up 2 fingers, then you get to jump the queue as long as it really isn't. So with that, I said we'd start with folks in the class, maybe 1 or 2 questions first. And then if you want to get my attention because you want to ask a question, I'll try to keep a list. I'll put up my class.
Hello, Professor Powell. Thank you so much. My question has to do with, your framework, I think, really covers a lot of aspects, and I feel like sometimes it can feel really daunting not knowing where to start. And so and I really like the way that Professor Minich really talked about from your point of view, like what can you start doing? So I guess from a grassroots perspective, or even just like an individual perspective for those of us in the room, like where do you feel like we can start to advocate for some of the things that you mentioned?
I think that would go to really this idea that we need to be supporting disabled people that are already doing the work. So lawyers are always saying, sort of, what should I do? And I would say we need to ask those that are already doing it how you can support them in doing it. Disabled people are experts on their lives. And so I think we're sort of over people telling us what's right and wrong for us. So I think bringing people with disabilities to the table. And again, I want to emphasize not in a tokenized way. I've been invited to so many tables just so they could check a box, and I'm over that. So if you're not allowing me to talk, I'm not coming to your table. I think bringing people with disabilities to the table, as we're working on increasing diversity in our efforts, make sure disability is in your work. And I really don't think you can take next steps until you've really brought disabled people. That is really, I can't emphasize that enough, that it's sort of beyond nothing about us without us. It needs to be by us, for us. And sort of how do we bring those voices to the table, and particularly focus on those that have been left out of so many tables, which again are the multiply marginalized people with disabilities. I would also add people with mental health disabilities, people with chronic health conditions, people with intellectual disabilities, sort of those that we don't picture as having disabilities.
You all put so much on the table. I think even if I had to ask a question right now, I'd be, and I really, really, really appreciate because there were a lot of very specific proposals up there, an awful lot.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in not identifying a problem without having a solution. I think people like to identify problems and less are interested in coming up with solutions.
And the Chris, which ones are you gonna take on?
Right. And you'll be happy to know in another paper I wrote about the family policing system, I focus a lot on changing the narrative, which
Yeah.
involves all of that field.
Really?
Sorry.
Joe.
Oh, sorry. Hi, hi, Chris Powell. So just based on your article and also discussions we had today during lunch, I appreciate how you're talking about like, coming up with solutions, and I feel like, we pointed out both like, realistic like short-term solutions and long-term solutions, and you mentioned again one of your long-term solutions was like completely abolishing the family policing system. And I guess in some way we're discussing like, what other, I don't know if there are any other systems you identified that need to be abolished to like, I guess like help the disability reproductive.
Yeah,
system.
so I think, again, I have written extensively on why we need to abolish the family policing system, and I say this as a former social worker. So I feel like I have street cred. I am a former social worker. So I feel like that gives me a little credence to say such a thing, because social workers get really mad when I say it, and then I bring up that piece. But I think the main other system that needs to be abolished is the guardianship system. And so why do I say this? Well, the family policing system is not about protecting families. And it is not broken. The family policing system is not broken. It is doing exactly what is intended to do, which is to separate and police families, particularly those that are marginalized. Dorothy Roberts has done an exceptional body of work on this issue, and she talks about if you were to go into a courtroom in any day, you would think it is a system that is intended to tear apart families of color, and that's because that is the only family that you see. You see families of color, poor families, and disabled parents. So that has to be abolished. The guardianship system is also not broken because it is doing exactly what it's intended to do, which is to take bodily autonomy away from people with disabilities. That is literally its purpose. And so I think that system also has to be abolished. And I don't believe you can fix systems that aren't broken. The systems aren't broken. They're doing what they're supposed to do. So how do you fix an unbroken?
Okay, Kayla, and anybody can get my attention. Ask a question.
Hi. So something that really stood out for me from your lecture now was that there seems to be a lot of ableism and discrimination with healthcare providers. And I was wondering if you could speak more into why that is. Is it from a lack of proper training and the education that they go through? Is it just a reaction to the social stigma around them? Or is it, especially when considering that they're more likely to report disabled people and families to the family policing system? Is it just a lack of understanding of how that system is operating, or maybe a combination of all of those?
Right. I mean, I think for sure it's a lack of training, but I also think it is more deeply ingrained. The medical model of disability is all about curing and fixing disabilities. And the medical profession is still very ingrained in the medical model. So they see a disabled person and they see that needing to be fixed. That is the issue. The disability is the issue. And to give you a very recent experience, which is definitely TMI, but I already told my students the other day, I had to go to the ER a month and a half ago. And I was in excruciating pain. I was pretty convinced I was dying in that moment. I was fairly confident that was my last day on the world. Not to be dramatic, but so I had to do the intake, and I didn't put my disability as a health condition or a current symptom. And it was because I was having excruciating stomach pain, and that had nothing to do with my disability. And so the doctor comes in to me and says, "So what's going on there?" And I'm like, "Well, I think I might be dying. I'm pretty sure my stomach is about to explode." And she's like, "No, what's going on there?" And I'm like, "There? I just told you there." And she's like, "Why aren't your legs working?" And I was like, whoa. I have this disability, so you could ask what my disability is if that's what you're asking. And I said, "This is my disability." She's like, "Well, what's that?" I'm like, "That is exactly why I did not tell you what my disability is, because you don't know it. It is completely irrelevant to this conversation." I had a kidney stone, literally zero to do with my disability. It couldn't be less related to my disability. But she spent a good 5-10 minutes focused on my disability. And again, it was because she was convinced that my disability was completely linked to it. It was not. Yeah, nothing to do. Could not be further from the truth. But medical professionals, they see the disability, and that is the thing they narrow in on. And so I truly believe that there are two professions that are the most ableist. And that happens to be the two professions that disabled people are most interacting with. It is the healthcare profession, it is the legal profession, which is maybe not good to say, but those are the two systems I find to be the most ableist.
So I want to jump in actually, and just to get you two to talk to each other a little bit, because I really liked, I think the question about the pre-Dobbs, like, what is it about Dobbs? I mean, Dobbs, yeah, Dorothy Roberts wrote a whole paper too about that. I don't know if you've seen it, it's very funny because we just read it. She was also very angry about the adoption language for very similar reasons. But I take Julie's point to be, and you would agree, and you've been writing about it and following it for a long time, a lot of this stuff has been very present. And even many of your policy proposals, I bet, would have been similar before Dobbs. So that's your question? What's the, I mean, they're so entrenched, like, should we focus, are we focusing too much on Dobbs?
I don't want to say we're focused too much. I think that I fully agree that these issues were absolutely ever present before Dobbs. Many of these. However, I also believe that they have been truly exacerbated by Dobbs. And that Dobbs has added sort of another layer of help, essentially, to the disabled people's community. And I also think that that is critical to recognize, because even in sort of the post-Dobbs world, whether it's the media or even scholars, disability is never talked about in the world of Dobbs. I also think that, and I said this earlier to students, if there was one good thing to come of Dobbs, and I know it's shocking that I'm going to say these words, but there is one good thing that's come of Dobbs, and that is that people with disabilities, the disability rights groups, are finally recognizing abortion as something that we talked about in the disability world. And historically, disabled people, particularly disability rights groups, have shied away from the topic because, as you mentioned, it can be uncomfortable. It is a long history that is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, both on the abortion rights side and the anti-abortion side. But for far too long, disability rights groups have just avoided it because it would mean having those difficult conversations about what abortion means for the disability community in general. And now we're seeing, because of Dobbs, that we need to move beyond sort of these hypothetical fetuses with disability diagnosis to actually recognizing the impact on actual disabled people. So I think that Dobbs has highlighted a problem and amplified it.
You were amplifying it.
I'm trying.
I see.
I want to make sure
Yeah,
students
yes,
are able to
yes,
ask
yes,
questions.
No.
So I was taken with the idea of using the 504 HHS regs. And I wonder, what are you thinking that an attorney representing a parent would use it in that direct representation? Or is it more systemic litigation that you're thinking about how it could be used systemically to change things in a state?
I think both. So one of the big issues with the ADA has been that judges don't seem to concretely understand how the ADA applies to family policing. Because of course, the family policing system is not a word, or the child welfare system is not a word that exists in the ADA. And while it most definitely undoubtedly applies to the child welfare system, now we have regulations that are very explicit that child welfare agencies must comply with the rehabilitation. So I think that very specification offers opportunities for lawyers, both on individual cases, to say, see, because judges have always said this doesn't apply to us, or this doesn't apply to them, but now judges won't be able to say that because the regs explicitly say contrary to that. And then from a systemic point, I think we can look at sort of what are agencies' policies in general. What are their assessment policies? That's something that's talked about a lot in the regulations of how are agencies assessing parents' capabilities, and they're often doing so in very ableist ways. Something that is common is to use an IQ score. And I often urge people to think about the smartest parent you know. Are they a good parent? Maybe, maybe not. But if they are a good parent, it probably has nothing to do with their intelligence level. And so why are we using such a ridiculous measure? And a measure that's been scientifically disproven. IQ score is not comparable with parenting ability. There's research from 1942. Another assessment mechanism is to just look at psychiatric records. And you'll say, well, did you actually observe interaction between the parent and the child? No, we don't need to. We just have the medical record. That is a horrible way. And particularly to focus on someone who's having a mental health crisis, that doesn't tell you how they are as a parent. It tells you how they are in that one exact moment and not as a whole. And so again, these are sort of systemic issues that we can be addressing. What are the assessments? And again, go back to what I said earlier. In an ideal world, I'm undoubtedly an abolitionist. I think we need to abolish the whole system. But I think sort of what we need to do is work towards non-reformist reforms, and one of them is to increase the number of people that are in the system. And so we need to really be addressing sort of closing that front door.
I was dismayed that the ADA is not, supporting people with disabilities in practice or in public.
Yes, I mean, the ADA, again, the ADA most undoubtedly applies to every topic I've talked about today. The ADA is very relevant. But we are facing systems that are still entrenched in all of their antiquated draconian views of disability. And so the laws are not fully applied or complied with. The ADA is also, like all civil rights laws, complaint driven. And when you are experiencing having your child removed, do you really have time to start filing complaints? Absolutely not. And parents with disabilities don't want to rock the boat. They already are sort of having everything used against them. Not a great time to be raising your rights. And the fact of the matter also is, and I talk about this a lot in my abolition papers, the ADA doesn't stop people from getting referred to the family policing. Is in theory maybe going to help once you've opened the door to the system, but let's keep people out of the system. The ADA doesn't. Because it doesn't address poverty. It doesn't address housing issues. It doesn't, it's sort of all of the system doesn't address sort of racial injustice. All of the issues that sort of lead to the involvement with the family policing system, the ADA can't address.
Mine's kind of a follow-up on that. You know, legislative solutions, I think, oftentimes look great on paper, but then given this societal stigma, they're so laws, like you were saying, are so inequitably applied. I'm wondering, like, how do we kind of approach legislative and social change? Does one need to happen before the other? And kind of how do you make sure that when you're applying these legislative solutions, they are applied in the most equitable way possible?
Yeah, I mean, so as I tell my students, a law is only so good as it's implemented. You can have every law in the book, but if it's not being implemented appropriately, then it's just words on a piece of paper. And so it's sort of the question, the chicken or the egg, what came first? Do you change society or do you change the law? And I think what we know is they have to sort of go hand in hand. But I don't think they can be disconnected from one another. I think you have to do two things at once. I really do truly believe it's sort of, we have to sort of confront it from both directions. One of the things I talk about in my abolition paper, I mentioned a few minutes ago, is I do talk a lot about how we have to change the narratives. And I think that's on not just sort of the media and et cetera, but also on lawyers. There are ways you can change the narrative, even in family policing cases. You know, you go in and you say, you know, this is a systemic problem. This is not related to the parent I'm representing today. This is a system that is inherently ableist, and you need to recognize that history when you're dealing with this issue. This is not the parent's fault. This is a systemic failure, and sort of, I think, changing that narrative around and sort of taking it away from the parent and placing the blame on the system.
Question, because a couple of us at this table are in social work school actually, so I appreciate that you are kind of promoting this interdisciplinary approach. And a lot of people are like direct service providers, or even if we are working on more of like a systemic macro level, like we have a lot of interactions with direct service providers and some of the community care that is, I think, necessary in these cases. And so I'm curious, like, on the point of changing the narrative, like, what resources do you look to that can help people like really understand this issue well, so that we can kind of be really good communicators in our advocacy?
Well, I think it goes back to what I said early on, bringing disabled people to the table and including them. you know, when I was in social work school, we didn't talk about disability at all. So I'm assuming that the social work curriculum has not changed much, although it's been a few decades for me. I'm assuming that there is not a lot of disability justice, for example, discussed in social work curriculum. And I'm assuming that it is still somewhat medicalized and sort of how do we care for people? How do we make decisions? And instead we need to be empowering people and how do we support them in being who they want to be and living the lives they want to live? So it means taking a back seat, letting sort of the disabled person drive the car, so to speak, and sort of being their support as they need. You know, I always tell this story. A few years ago, a child welfare agency called me up and they said to me, I have a parent, just gave birth, she's paralyzed on her left side, what help does she need? And I was like, well, thank you for calling me, instead of acting, I suppose. I said, but I don't know the parent, I've never met the parent in my life. If she walked by me today, I wouldn't know who she was. I said, I don't know what her support system is, I don't know how accessible her home is, and most importantly, I don't know if she needs help. But you're assuming she needs help. I said, have you ever asked her if she needs help? And they're like, oh, should we do that? And I was like, that's where you should have started this conversation. So we need to assume competence and then offer support as asked or requested. We gotta flip that whole entire narrative. We're assuming incompetence and then trying to help. Let's flip the way we think about it.
Really particular, like particular, like activists that we can follow and like people like you and organizations.
So there's really a lot of good disability justice activists. Sins Invalid is a good group, but there's others. There's also some good social work scholars out there that are doing abolitionist work in the disability world. Elspeth Slater is one that comes to mind, but there are a lot of others. If you should be looking at the abolition, sort of the intersection of social work, disability, and abolitionism.
You all are allowed. Thank you all.
You can Google it.
Okay, so we're at time. I don't know if you want to jump back in for a second.
I mean, I think I would also just add to, as you're consuming art and culture and things like that, also to look at art made by disabled people, because I think one of the things too is just that like the reason like people don't even think about disabled parents is because there are no like representations. Like people like it's been sort of excluded even from the realm of the imagination. So I was really glad you mentioned Sins Invalid, right? Because they're a theater group actually, or like a performance art group. And members of that group, people like Aurora Vince Morales and Eli Clare, like they have memoirs and they have like you can read their work too. So I would say also to seek out disabled cultural producers, right? To like find rich representations of disabled people's lives that include sexuality and include parenting.
Well, you all have, so first of all, you've been unbelievably generous with your time today, Robyn, and I've met with the students and I feel like, yeah, and they still want more, they still want more. So really appreciate that and all the time and energy you put into the presentation. Appreciate very much your interventions, Julie, and leaving some things out there for us to continue to think about as well. And very much appreciate folks coming from far away, like a few buildings, and you're welcome back anytime. We'll be meeting every 2 weeks, and schedules over there. So hope to see you again soon. Thank you all.